everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. This is session number 1 of the VMware Code Study Group. But this one is now, we have concluded the VCP-VCF Administrator exam group. And now we are moving on to the VCP-VCF Architect exam. So with us, we have Pawel Piotrowski. Pawel, I've known, I think I met you probably through the Tanzu Vanguard, and probably through there, and then ever since then though, then I became then I started working here, VMware Code, and I got to meet Pawel at a VMware Explorer, yeah. So and then also the hackathon, right? So yeah, so I've been able to interact with Pawel. I've been lucky enough to interact with Pawel a couple times, but
those were two different explorers.
Yes. Oh yeah, and then even over at Explorer too. No, not Explorer, at Barcelona. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, we've been fortunate to meet in person a couple different times and stuff. But you know what? The most memorable thing though, because this all ties back to community, is I think the very first time I saw you, the very first time I actually met you in person, we were at the community party, at the VMware community party where back in
Okay.
yes, yeah, when they gave us a whole bunch of coins, and then we were, yeah, you had so many stuffed animals. You had, dude, like, yeah, you had to use 2 hands, and then you and your buddy, I don't remember your buddy's name, but you just had all these stuffed animals, and we're like, how are you getting these things? And of course, right, it's competition for everybody, and then with free coins because VMUG was also there, and yeah, we were just putting the coins in, and we kind of took over there too. So it was a supremely great time to just to hang out with the community members and not have to talk about tech or anything like that. But yeah, so memorable times.
That was fun actually. That was August. So this was the month that I actually discovered. I think that's not a good word, but this is that was the time. I think 2 weeks earlier, we discovered that we will have a baby. So I was, starting collecting all those stuffed animals for. I think at that time, no, definitely at that time, I didn't know whether that will be a boy or a girl. So they were all highly welcome. They do a great job now, so that was really fun.
Oh, see, I love it, man. Right,
Highly
and
recommend everyone.
yes, perfect. Right. So with that, right, yeah, I just want to start everybody off, right? This is not, at least to me, when we get together as a community, it's definitely nothing too serious, right? Because we're out here, everybody's on your own time, right? We want to learn, we want to get better, and let me hand off the mic to Pawel to help him, to have him introduce himself, and let's get this party started. Pawel?
All right. Thank you very much. So it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the opportunity. So my name is Pawel Piotrowski. As you might see, might not be easy to pronounce for some of you. I think we've met with some of you guys in the past. So the communities and IT world is not so big. So you know how it is. From my perspective or about myself, as we might not have met before, I do work mainly as a solutions architect, going through different roles in the past, but mostly, or I usually say nowadays that I worked with VCF before it became fancy, because now VCF is everywhere. You open the fridge and there is VCF, obviously. So I was working with it a little bit before that, meaning have some experience with the entire VMware stack, being member of code community, vExperts, Tanzu Vanguard, and probably a few other ones that might not exist anymore, but I think those are the keys, obviously. And today, I will test my screen share. So I did prepare a small presentation, let's say, and as you will notice in a moment, don't laugh on my PowerPoint skills, but this actually reminds me the time of, let's say, working on the VCDX defense for the first time, where I was working on my presentation. That's not something you should do. So that's a disclaimer. You are not going to pass with this method like I didn't. But I started building the presentation on the night before, actually on the plane when I was going to Staines in UK for the defense that I had next day. So that wasn't a good preparation for an exam. And partially because of that, there is this idea of building the study group around the VCP-VCF architect exam to help folks pass the exam, without the necessary or unnecessary stress, simply dividing all the content and objectives into chunks so we can discuss them one by one. That's the overall idea. Another disclaimer, I don't have this typical disclaimer slide as there are on the explore sessions and so on, but obviously whatever we are going to talk here or whatever I'm going to talk about is just my personal perspective, how we can understand different objectives. So there is no guarantee that you will listen to that or watch that and you will pass the exam. But I think that's it's not complete yet. So as you might have seen, there will be 6 sessions in total, if I remember correctly. I think so. So the list of objectives that we are going to cover was divided into mainly 5 different sessions. We will see how it goes. So there could be some more or maybe less time needed. And the last session was planned for Q&A. All of them, thanks to Frankie, will be recorded, will be shared, somewhere accessible for the community. Plus, we do have the study group on Discord. If you are not there, make sure to ping Frankie or myself to get there. I'm not sure, is it part, Frankie, of the V-Expert? No, that's a completely separate one, isn't it?
So that group, the Discord, it has everybody in there. But if you are a V-Expert, then you attach it to your profile, and then you get to unlock other channels. But
Okay.
yes, everybody can join. And yes, and thank you very much. One quick second. As Pawel's going through all these through the disclaimers, right? Now this definitely in no way replaces any, right? Yeah, this is a community effort, right? We're here for each other because we love each other, because we're awesome. And this does not replace like official training, nothing like that. So yeah, just keep that in mind, right? It's just like the other study group that we have. We're just people trying to help people. I will put the links over in the chat. Yes, to the Discord. So definitely feel free to join. And to the exam guide, and then the community exam guide that we were able to put together.
Yeah, so maybe to second that, definitely this is not a replacement for any, even though currently you don't need to attend an authorized training, this is not a replacement in any way. I'm also the VCI, so that's part of my business to deliver the authorized training, so definitely that's not a replacement. But from the perspective of the exam, because so far, I think there is no training which is focused on this exam. So going a little bit to the history, or maybe a question first. I said that there will be some questions where we can use emojis on the Zoom. So green tick if you already passed the VCP-VCF admin exam. Red cross if not. I've got 1.
I'm
What
trying to
about the
figure out how to
rest?
use the reaction. I'm sorry. Oh, there it is.
That's tricky. Depending on the Zoom version you've got and the type of device you've got, it might be not so easy. I think I've realized here when I'm presenting, I cannot use those. I did connect also with my iPad, and on the iPad, I can click reactions, and I've got them. That's okay. I can see some green ticks. I know that there are also some people that they didn't express their opinion, but also did make it already. That's good. So you got the feeling of those new exams, because historically, you might have seen a similar diagram to this one, which is directly from the VMware. We still have, I wanted to say we used to have, but we still have, or VMware does, different levels of certification. And that was maybe not super straightforward, but I think that was clear for everyone, at least for me, because we had different levels starting from the associate level, VCTA, VCP, VCAP, and VCDX. also different tracks. But once the Broadcom acquisition happened, this all started to become a little bit more complicated and vague, because those exams are still there. I don't know what, even if I would know, I cannot tell you what's the future, but I don't know what's the future with those exams. They are still there. You can take them whenever you want. However, you might notice that they are not in the latest releases. So example, NSX VCAP deploy, which is based on version 3. That's a little bit old one. Maybe it will be refreshed, maybe not. That's not my decision. But what we want to focus is the kind of new framework which we see becomes available. So this is copied from I also prepared some links, so let me just jump to my web browser for a second. So this simply comes from the VMware certification page where you've got all those different tracks. The only exception currently is that the EUC track obviously is gone. That's Omnisa part. We don't care about it. But the current VCF certificates, it seems that they are building their own track, because that's almost the only product that VMware currently sells, or VMware by Broadcom. It's a little bit funny, and I think it's a little bit messy on this page because the section is called VCF, and here we've got VVF, which stands for vSphere Foundation. But obviously we are focused on those two exams. Admin, study group, I think this topic is closed. If you didn't have a chance to take it, you are interested, there is I think all the recordings are there, and if you didn't see it, Frankie will definitely make sure that you've got the links. So we are focused on this one. One of the first things that I would recommend to start with if you are considering this exam, which personally I found cliche in the past, because everyone was saying you should start with blueprint objectives. That was especially the mantra when I was preparing for VCDX. Blueprint, blueprint, blueprint. But what I can see in this blueprint, there are no questions that I can practice with. There is no lecture I can read. So what about this blueprint? But now maybe I'm a little bit more mature when it comes to exams. I do see the value, because in the blueprint itself, you will find all the objectives that you are going to be tested on. And if you take it seriously and do whatever or something similar like we will do during this session and the next ones, you can break it down into particular objectives and actually, even think about the questions that they will ask you and think what you should know for these objectives and verify whether I know that. If I know, okay, let's go to the next one. So definitely the exam guide is here for you to help. From the prerequisites perspective, currently VMware by Broadcom doesn't require us to go for any exams, any training, any authorized training. Of course, it will be beneficial, but it's not mandatory. So from the blueprint perspective, or exam guide, how it's called, the topic for today are those two sections that two sections that I want to focus. Section 1, IT architectures, technologies, and standards, a couple of objectives here. And section 2 was relatively small, so I thought probably we can squeeze it in a single session. So that's the objectives for the day. And my plan for those sessions, we will see whether it works, whether you like it or not. If you've got any feedback, please do let me know. But my idea was to simply go objective by objective, discuss what potentially could be behind this objective and what kind of information, what kind of knowledge could be expected behind each of those objectives. This could be, and I think we can share this presentation with you later on. There is nothing secret. I just, as you can see, my PowerPoint skills are not the greatest, but it's not about PowerPoint skills. It's not to make it's not a sales presentation, so it doesn't have to be pretty. It's about the content. So the first objective that we've got is to differentiate between business and technical requirements. First of all, what's the business, what's the technical requirement? Business requirement will state what an organization needs to accomplish from the business perspective. And when it comes to the architecture, when it comes to business, everything we do should be mapped to business objectives. We are not going to make any decisions or use, even though Broadcom would be happy, we are not going to propose the customer a VCF or plan it for our environment because we like VMware or we like Broadcom or we like the technology. We do it to serve the purpose. We do it to satisfy the business objectives. Same with every single feature, whether we will use vSAN, high availability, DRS, fully automated mode, and so on. So all the physical decisions, this all on all levels should be mapped back to business. So from this perspective, business requirements that we might get, and here, I think it's useful to use your imagination and think when I talk with a business person like CEO, will the CEO tell me you have to configure or DRS should be configured in a fully automated mode? No, they don't even know what's DRS most likely, and they don't care. The business will tell you something like, I've got a couple of examples here. So let me use my drawing, if I can just find too many icons. All right, got it. So for example, what they can tell us is, doesn't work as expected. All right, I'm going to ignore it. I will use the mouse. So for example, the system must achieve 99.99% uptime for the business critical applications. SLA, what the business cares about usually is the money, income, reputations, maybe some competitiveness on the market, which could be also differentiated because our organization is compliant with some regulations. If I'm a financial institution, probably I've got some audits and I have to be PCI compliant. So that's what the business will tell us. That's the type of business requirements. On the other side, we've got technical requirements that will define how our solution should do something. For example, it must be able to connect with Active Directory, it must support the Linux operating system or the X number of users or sessions or whatever. And based on this current blueprints, because maybe one more, or doing one step back, positioning this exam, because we've got VCP-VCF admin and VCP-VCF architect. Historically, we had those clear levels. VCP, that was the admin exam. That was the exam for people that were, sitting in front of the console mostly and were able to do the magic so the environment worked. Then we had advanced professional, which was for more advanced admins that could do also the troubleshooting and implementation without any help and looking at the documentation. That was the deploy exam. That is, because it's still there. And we had the advanced professional design, which was focused on the architecture. And from this perspective, in terms of the content and type of questions, probably I would compare the VCP-VCF architect to this VCAP exam, because that's a design scenario-oriented questions. Yeah. I wouldn't expect that a question how to configure DRS or which box you need to select in vSphere HA to do something. That's not the type of question we will get here. However, it has VCP in the name. It doesn't have advanced in the name, which probably means it should be a little bit easier than the VCAP exam. Yeah, probably there is a very tiny line whether it is easier or not. But type of questions, if you did take the VCAP exam, that's probably similar type of questions. However, it has also VCF in the name, which means the scope is broad. And this is yet another reason why we should pay attention to the exam guide and the blueprint in general, because that will show us what's the technologies that we are going to be tested on. As VCF is broad, there is vSphere, there is vSAN, there is NSX. There are also a couple of other products, including the entire ARIA stack. And this is a fair game to ask questions about. However, the first section in the blueprint, when we talk about something like here, differentiate between business and technical requirements, that's rather generic. So the examples that we've got might be specific to VCF, but this is still a generic concept. So you just need to differentiate. And I think it's not as bad because we also can classify requirements as technical and non-technical. So how and what, which was always very complicated to differentiate them. Nowadays, I don't see it for this exam in the blueprints, so I wouldn't expect questions for that. Yeah. So this is the first objective. Be prepared probably for similar examples or maybe different examples, but the same idea. Yeah. I would expect here maybe that they will test whether I know whether I can differentiate the business from technical requirement. So for the next session, I'm going to prepare a couple of, hopefully the same group will be there, because for the next one, I will prepare a couple of examples where we will test your knowledge, let's say. So we will see how it goes. The next objective is to differentiate between conceptual, I don't know why it's called, but conceptual model, logical design, and physical design. So what's that? This is something we use based on the TOGAF and ZACMA methodologies in VMware a lot. That's also what we do for the VCDX. Some other vendors and other frameworks are relying just the high level and low level design, but we are interested in those three aspects. So what's the difference between conceptual, logical, and conceptual model, logical design, and physical design? Conceptual model, or maybe that's a question, just to test some of your knowledge, like on the exam. So who would tell us what's the difference between conceptual and logical first? Don't be shy.
Do you want me to jump in?
No,
the
John.
expert sector?
That would be not fair, I think, John.
Okay, I'll let somebody else jump in.
I will look for another candidate.
I've always understood the conceptual model as something you would actually present to a board. It's so high level that they can't get lost in technical detail. You're not even talking about technical details at that level. It's just the overall picture of things.
Indeed. So it's like comparing to building a house. It's like saying, I want to build a house and it will have a roof and it will have doors and windows, but that's it. So it's still very flexible for interpretation. But from the perspective of the, let's say, preparing documents and what we share with customers, and also from the perspective of this exam, when we talk about conceptual model, this is the place where we put all the requirements, constraints, assumptions that should be validated, and risks. Maybe some very high level diagrams, as you said, something that we will present to the board, but super high level. Most important here are requirements, constraints, maybe risks that we identified, and assumptions that, again, should be validated. So this is our first step. Based on that, we are going to build the logical design. And in the logical design, we are going to start making decisions. So we've got those requirements that we've collected from customers during different workshops with stakeholders. So this is another aspect which is not tested in the exam, but obviously important to make sure that you've got the correct audience and you did capture the requirements well. But once we've got that, we can start working on the logical level, logical design, where we actually make design decisions with their justifications and implications, aka risks. The logical level in the, let's say, ideal world, or not ideal, in a typical scenario, logical level and your decisions that you make there will still be relatively on a high level. So this will be something like my house will have 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, 2 bathrooms, and so on. I'm not specifying how big each bedroom will be. So when we translate it to the VMware world or the IT infrastructure, in a typical scenario, we should also keep it technology agnostic. So of course, this is a VMware exam, so it's not a secret, yeah? It's like on the VCDX, we use the term hypervisor or ASXI or ASXI cluster or whatever. But again, if we would like to keep it agnostic, this should be, for example, said hypervisor or virtualization will be used without mentioning any specific brand or a vendor, because this is still the level that potentially the client or customer could take and go to the market, and there could be multiple partners and vendors that will be able to offer a solution, for example, based on their own stack. But of course, again, we are, talking about VMware. So obviously, those examples that we are going to consider here will be related to the VMware technology. And those design decisions obviously need the justification. Again, we are not going to make a decision to use consolidated architecture in VCF or standards because we feel it's more flexible or we like it. We do it to satisfy the business requirements, to serve the purpose. So we also need to justify and map back our decisions to requirements, why we are doing that. And here, obviously, we will also have some, probably for the perspective of this exam doesn't matter, but in a typical document, when you prepare the architecture design, you will obviously have some diagrams that are going to show what you are building or what you are proposing. And finally, we've got the physical design. In the physical design, a good description of a physical design that I've heard some time ago was that there is nothing that would be too physical to put in a physical design. This is the place where you document all the physical configuration, IP addresses, connections, cables between the top of rack switch and the server, FQDNs, all the nitty-gritty configuration details about vSphere HA, advanced settings of DRS, and so on and so on. So you put all of that here, but still those physical decisions are based, or this physical configuration and physical design is based on the logical decisions that we've made. For the simplicity or readability, usually when we are working on documents, we put, or I do, and probably most of people does, put those physical details in an Excel spreadsheet, because if you start describing all of that in a Word document, it could make a nightmare to read it. So conceptual model, based on that, we make logical, mapped to conceptual, and then we've got physical. And Evert, you think, well, ramps or AMPRS wasn't explained, might be useful, but it will be explained as it deserved its own objective. So I will get back to it. In terms of the exam itself, what we could probably expect here could be maybe some kind of checks, whether we know what's in the conceptual, what's in the physical, maybe some examples of a decision that was made, and we have to decide whether this should be, the physical part or not. Maybe some description. I think there are no descriptions, but you need to know what's the difference. Once you know it, you should be able to apply it to any questions that you will get. The next thing is to differentiate between requirements, assumptions, constraints, and risks. So attributes of the conceptual design, conceptual model. We don't call it design anymore, conceptual model. So what are the constraints? Requirements we've discussed. What are the constraints? Constraints are simply all those things that you get from the customer that will limit your options as an architect. If the customer tells you, we have to use or we bought servers already, we have to use them. Or we've got the licenses, we have to use them. Or we've got this backup tool, we have to use it. That's a constraint, because as an architect, you cannot make your own decision. Even if you feel, and you've got some proofs for that based on the customer requirements, that another option, another solution would be better, would be more aligned with the customer requirements, you cannot do much about that because there is a constraint which is going to set the boundaries for you. And those constraints in a VCF world, there are the so-called fixed design decisions. For me, they are also like a kind of constraints. Because for example, the usage of vSAN in the management domain, I'm not talking about the import, but let's say the greenfield, you have to use vSAN. So this is a kind of constraint for the architects, definitely in my opinion. But that's a different story. Another thing, and I put an example here, because very often requirements are confused with constraints, but they work slightly different. So if you look at this requirement here, which says the design must use shared storage, that's a requirement. Customer doesn't tell us, probably customer will not, or depends who's the stakeholder and who are we talking with, but probably they are not going to even directly say that it must use shared storage. But even if they do, this is still open. I can decide to use vSAN, because that's a shared storage. I can use Fiber Channel, I can use NFS, I can use vendor A, B, C, and so on. So that's not going to limit my options. The constraint, on the other hand, would be something like the design must use the existing shared storage array. So this actually defines exactly the device, the solution, the vendor, the technology that I have to use. In this case, I have no other choice unless we decide that it's not capable enough and it will not satisfy the requirements, then we can probably negotiate with the customer. But from the perspective of the design, that's a constraint. So there is sometimes a very tiny line and you have to be careful with that. Assumptions, that's your, I'm not going to say NA, but you have to be careful with assumptions. So what's an assumption? Assumption is a statement that we make in case we are missing some information. This is usually the beginning of the architecture and design process. When you maybe meet with the customer for the first time, you've got stakeholders, but maybe not all the stakeholders are in the room. You are asking some questions, but you cannot get the answer because the customer doesn't know, or maybe it has to be checked. So to fill those gaps, we make assumptions. But it's very important to make sure that all your assumptions are validated. Because if you assume that, a common one, we often assume that there is enough space in a data center. We will bring maybe new hardware for our new shiny infrastructure. And of course, we are not going to build a new data center in most cases. So we have to check, do we have enough space? Do we have enough cooling? Do we have enough power? Maybe that's not the question that immediately the customer can answer. So we will assume that we do have enough capacity and facilities in a data center, and all the networking and infrastructure services we will depend on are highly available, reliable, and compliant with other SLA and so on. But this is something we have to validate. Because if it's not validated, that becomes a risk, and that can cause problems. So once you are done with your architecture design, there shouldn't be any open assumptions. So either you validate them and we know they are correct, or if it cannot be validated, or if it was validated to not be true, that becomes your risk, and then you have to deal with that risk somehow. And what is the So I'm looking at the chart in the meantime as well, so I will try to cover those questions when they are coming. So what is the difference between the requirements and constraints? That's what we had here. The requirement defines you what you need to do, what the customer needs. The constraint is, let's say, forcing you to do something in a certain way. So when the customer say, like here, we should use shared storage, that's a requirement, because I can use storage from vendor A, B, C, and D. I can use Fiber Channel, I can use vSAN, I can use something else depending on other maybe requirements and other decisions I will make. But if the customer say, you have to use, we already have a storage array, and you have to use it, you must use it, that's your constraint. You cannot make a decision. You cannot decide on your own that you would like to this storage or that storage technology because you have to use this one. Would assumptions all be technical or could be related to staffing training? That could be both. So you might have an assumption where, let's say, we assume that the customer will be able to take over and manage the new infrastructure or the private cloud that we are building. We don't know that, maybe. So that's an assumption, which also have to be validated. So they don't have to be purely technical. They definitely could be, let's say, soft. Same like with risks. That could be related to budget, that could be related to training, experience, staff, and so on. So the last piece of the conceptual model is about risk, and that's a whole separate topic that we could probably, spend a couple of next hours, and that wouldn't exhaust the topic. But in a nutshell, something that you should know at least as a minimum for the exam itself, the risk is something that's going to negatively affect your design. Typical risks is the budget, it's the lack of redundancy on some services. That's my favorite one. The easiest is the lack of experience of the customer or admins, IT staff. I say it's my favorite one because it's easy to mitigate, it's easy to handle it. Because when we talk about risks, there is one objective when we have to differentiate between requirements, assumptions, constraints, and risks. But there is another objective that I just combined here, 1.5, where we have to develop and document a mitigation strategy for our risks. And there are, if only I've managed to do it. There are a couple of mitigation strategies. Depending on the framework or documents that you are reading, you might find the terminology used a little bit differently. But this one actually I took from VMware. So that's hopefully also the one that's going to be used on the exam if it is in there. What we can do with a risk. We can accept, depending on a risk, that's probably something we should avoid, but sometimes there is no other option. So we know the risk is there. We did communicate the risk to the customer, to the stakeholders. Maybe it's minor in terms of the impact, and the stakeholders agree to accept it. Okay, we know it's there. It's probably not going to be materialized, but still we should be aware of that risk. It should be signed by the customer. And I would anyway think, how and what we are going to do if it's going to be materialized. So maybe some standard operating procedures just to be prepared. We can avoid the risk. So maybe modify our project or schedule to minimize the potential impact of the risk. And when we assess risks, there is also the probability and the impact of the risk that we should take into consideration. It might be part of this objective. So also differentiating, because we might handle different risks a little bit differently depending, how big the impact is and how high the chances are that it's going to happen. we can control a risk, which is taking an action to minimizing the impacts. So it's those definitions that you can see that are a little bit close to each other. We can transfer the risk. So simply try to put it on someone else's desk. Yeah, maybe that's not so nice, but that could be especially in regards of some maybe hardware vendors, maybe there is a bug. So obviously this is out of our power. We can monitor that, but we cannot handle it on our own. So we will transfer it to usually external entities or maybe someone within the organization. And continue monitoring that should be related to the other mitigation strategies, because in my opinion, in most cases, still you need to monitor it. And I just see, yes, there is also a very good note from John regarding. So what I'm going to do, this presentation will be shared with you, and I've got a slide, the last one, where I've got a couple of useful links, which is going to be filled with a few more, because indeed, as John mentioned on the chat, there is a super useful, in my opinion, IT architect series, and I can tell that because John was involved in that, but I can tell that as a reader and someone who was consuming that stuff, it's super useful. There is also an old book, which I also will include in that list. That was the VCAP, a very old one, VCAP Design Study Guides, which was also covering, especially those objectives that I'm discussing right now. They are, again, pretty generic. So the overall concept was also covered there. The other stuff that we are going to cover as part of the specific objectives, it's not necessarily there, but for the generic one, which is a significant part of the blueprint anyway, it's covered. So that's 1.5. As part of that, you might also maybe be tested on things like there is a scenario, there are some decisions or situations that introduced a risk, and you will have to maybe identify how to deal with this risk. That could be in terms of selecting the right strategy, or maybe finding or selecting, not finding, but selecting the right approach how to deal with it. However, those terms for the mitigation strategy, it's also something that you should be aware of. And finally, we've got ramps or AMPRS, which are design qualities that we use on the logical level to assess our decisions and what kind of impact. So we use it, I think, for two scenarios. One is to classify our requirements, whether they are related to availability, manageability, performance, recoverability, or security, but also in terms of the making the design decision, especially when you've got a, let's say, more serious design decision to be made with a couple of alternatives. You can assess them through the design qualities, verifying and checking and documenting how they will affect particular qualities. So when we talk, sometimes I do consider also the cost, because especially nowadays, that's an important factor. But when it comes to those ramps or AMPRS, however you want to call it, we've got availability, which mostly is measured in terms of the uptime that's expressed in class of nines, the redundancy, so all the stuff, no single point of failure and so on. Manageability, and here I've selected or highlighted, because when we usually hear manageability, we mostly think about the lifecycle management. How easy it is going to manage this environment, to handle it. But it's not only about the lifecycle management, it's also about the scalability and capacity planning, including the growth and so on. Performance, probably the easiest. So here we've got ramps, I prefer AMPRS, I think. Ramps is harder to pronounce. But getting back to performance. So performance, throughput, latency, transactions per second, connections, all that stuff. Recoverability, RTO and RPO, that's two important parameters that you have to be aware of. So recovery time objective, MTD, of course, as well, but especially, I would say, RTO and RPO. Recovery time objective. So how much time we need to recover from particular scenario after a disaster. And recovery point objective. So what will be the gap between the state of application systems data at the moment where the disaster happened versus the moment that we are. So how, in other words, how much data or information we are able to lose, or how much we can accept to lose. And there are different technologies and different ways of dealing with those RPO. Of course, it's same like with the uptime. So the more nines we've got, the more expensive it's going to be. And of course, customers and admins and everyone would like to have it, 100% uptime, but you know how it is. So every additional 9 will probably add the 0 to the budget. And on the other hand, for the same projects, usually, so the uptime expectations are high, but the budget constraint and budget itself is rather low. So this is also something we need to take into consideration. And security, everything related to security, compliance, all the rollback and such stuff. And here I've got two examples, which I spoiled the first one. So a potential question that I can think about related to these objectives might be a list of statements or requirements, and I'm asked to classify them. So for example, something like the environment must be compliant with ISO or PCI or HIPAA, FISMA, DISA, or any other security-related acronym. That obviously will be security, because I already said that. But the next one, I didn't mention it. So the solution must scale by 20% over the next 3 years. Which kind of design quality is that? You can use the chat or unmute yourself, whatever you prefer. Evert, I see you are unmuted.
Yeah, manageability, I guess.
Yes, you guessed us. And Don, perfect timing, so you are exactly the same spot. Yes, indeed, that's manageability. It is related to one of the components, one of the aspects of manageability. In this case, I would say that's part of the scalability. Yeah. So this is also something we might be asked for. I wouldn't rather spend much time learning those descriptions, but for example, how particular qualities could be measured or examples of different qualities, definitely I think it's worth to do it. Another thing, Objective 1.6, document design decisions. Here is an example of a table with a design decision. That's most likely not something you will be asked on the exam to do, build a table or anything like that to show that you can do that. But you should know that all design decisions are based on requirements. So there might be a scenario with some outputs after a workshop with the customer, a list of requirements or constraints or a risks, and you might need to make a design decision based on that. And I know those questions could be a little bit, maybe not vague, but some people probably could argue whether this or that design decision will be best in this scenario. Hopefully there is no ambiguity in the exam, but still you have to keep in mind to map it to requirements. So even though you feel that one of the answers is, let's say, the so-called best practice, you feel that this is the way I was doing for the last 20 years, so that's how it should be done. It doesn't necessarily have to be the correct answer, because maybe the requirements or risks that were introduced in the scenario will actually lead you to a completely opposite direction. As part of the design decision, this is just a sample table. It could be bigger, could be smaller, up to the project, customer, and how much time we've got to prepare those. Because if you consider, for a typical engagement, you might have hundreds of design decisions. Most likely, you might not have this luxury of documenting all of them in this form. But apart from the ID, decision should be clearly defined. You have to remember about justification. Mapping it back to the conceptual model definitely is something we should also do for the traceability. Justification and implication, that's something that you also shouldn't neglect. So when we make a decision, what kind of justification, why we are doing this decision? This, again, should be mapped to conceptual model. And almost every single decision that you make will have an impact or implication or a risk. Even if it's something that you feel doesn't have any implication, doesn't have any risk, this is just a small setting that we are changing here. But even if you change the default setting, I always say, there is a risk. Someone might not remember that this was done on this cluster or that host while adding additional ones. So that definitely introduces a risk. It's a minor. You can just cover it and handle with the standard operating procedures, but definitely this is something that should be taken into consideration. And justification, same story. Because maybe you will present it to the board, maybe you will present it to the customer, and they can ask, hey, why did you decide to build those 5 clusters here? Why not put it in a single one and decrease the overall cost? You are not going to decide how many clusters we will build, or again, standard versus consolidated, or stretch cluster versus a single availability zone topology, because you like it, because you feel, oh, this customer, that's a financial institution, so that's how we should do it. No, again, that should be based on the requirements. And from the perspective of this objective, I think there might be, again, some scenarios, and it's probably not to document the decision as the objective says, but rather make the decision. I think that's how it should be called. Could be also maybe a question like, what kind of attributes should we put while documenting design decisions? So then I would definitely set the decision ID, justification, implication. Maybe that will be a choose multiple answers kind of question or something like that. So those are definitely attributes which will be related to decisions. The next one, develop a design validation strategy. How we will validate that all the requirements that we were given are satisfied. So when we make those decisions, this is also why I said we should map it back to the conceptual model. Here, for example, the requirements, or maybe we do decide to do this or XYZ because of following risk. So we do have this mapping, which should be part of the requirements traceability matrix. But for some requirements, that might not be enough to say, I did this. Especially when it comes to requirements related to SLA, SLO, the recoverability, performance. So if the customer requires RTO of 2 hours, okay, maybe we've created the backup job and we believe that we can restore everything within 2 hours. But just because we believe in that is not enough. So for those kind of scenarios, maybe we should run some simulation or failover scenario, or do a complete disaster scenario test, because the customer also might be obliged to do it, by law or by some regulations. So we have to think how, not only what we will do, but also how we are going to prove that we did accomplish it. So that could be some performance tests, that could be some simulations. Maybe we'll use the live recovery and we will simulate a failover. Maybe we'll do the actual failover if we can afford. So that all depends on the requirements and what we are actually building, but we also have to think a plan. So in this case, think what kind of options we've got to validate different decisions in terms of VCF. How I will validate that the network performance with NSX that we've planned with 2 NSX edges will satisfy the XYZ throughput or the latency of a couple of milliseconds that were defined by the customer. How we will ensure that the vSAN and the disk that we decided to use will satisfy those requirements. So those are the things that you should take into consideration here. And the last thing, because I know we are running out of time, but I think we can squeeze that. That's already the section number 2 and objective 2.1, where we start digging slowly into the VCF specific concept. So this one says, based on a scenario, differentiate between VCF architecture options. From the architecture perspective, if you would ask me, I would say we've got 2, consolidated and standard. Consolidated means that there is only one domain, the management domain, where we run both management and all the other workloads. So there is no separation on the workload domain level. I don't have any other workload domain for my other stuff. So that's typically scenarios for usually small customers, small environments where we need to minimize the overhead, the server footprint, and all of those cases. The standard architecture is when we've got dedicated management domain for our management stack, so all the vCenters, NSX instances or NSX manager clusters, SDDC manager, the entire ARIA stack, and whatever we consider as management, plus separate VI workload domains for production, tests, Kubernetes, VDIs, or whatever the customer needs. So we've got this clear separation here. That's the main 2 architectures, if you ask me. However, from the perspective of Broadcom and documentation, there are actually 5 topologies. I've got the link to this documentation in the appendix, but there is a topology 1 with a single instance. As an instance, we mean VCF instance. So a single SDDC manager and 1 or more workload domains, most likely. And it could be single. It should be probably added standard because that's what we mean. So single instance with a single availability zone, consolidated single instance with a single availability zone, single instance and multi-availability zones, which basically means stretch cluster, will be involved. Multiple instances, single availability zone, and multiple and multiple. So there are a couple of diagrams which will describe that. Single instance, 1 SDDC manager, 2 AZs. And probably some clusters at least will be stretched. Otherwise, we wouldn't do that. So this is single instance, multiple AZs. This one, multiple instances, single availability zones. So this is instance 1. We've got here the management domain. This is instance 2. Maybe there is the 3rd one, 4th one, 5th one, and so on. There might be questions and scenarios that will lead to a decision to use one or the other topology. Maybe a question to define or explain what's in a particular topology, but rather probably a scenarios that will give you the customer requirements. Maybe customer has multiple regions, and each region should be, first of all, they are on different continents, and they should be managed independently, treated completely independently. So that could lead, for example, to the multi-instance scenario. There could be other where customer has 2 data centers in a metropolitan area or distance and needs to provide us, or you as an architect needs to provide a solution that will provide a protection against losing one of those data centers. So that could lead you to a stretch cluster and a multi-availability zone solution. So knowing that difference, and also according to the documentation, so that could be a little bit, maybe not tricky, but I think it's worth to note, because the objective says or ask about architecture options. In documentation, those are the architecture options. However, I've seen also in a couple of different places that as an architecture option, sometimes they also consider the isolated versus shared SSO domain. So also keep in mind that starting from, and that could be related to those scenarios. You might have a scenario, we've got a public cloud provider who's provisioning workload domain, VI workload domain for every single customer. And currently they've got 28 customers. Which topology should we use? And it could be a single or multiple instance, or let's say no, let's put it differently. We've got currently 20 customers. And there could be answers. Could we use single instance with shared SSO? Or the other answers could be single instance with isolated SSO. Another one could be multiple instances. Also in the scenario, maybe there is an information that we want to minimize the footprint currently. So that's going to rule out the multiple instances. So we will have the choice mostly between single instance, same SSO, or single instance with separate SSOs. In this case, it's generally, I don't like to learn configuration maximums because it doesn't provide any value. But in this case, I think it's important to remember that there are 2 numbers. So this is isolated SSO. We can do 24 VI workload domains. If we do shared SSO, we can do 14 VI workload domains. 14 plus management gives us 15, which is the limitation of enhanced link mode. That's where this number comes from. So if we have a need for 20 workload domains, we still can do it with a single instance, but we need to ensure that there is isolated SSO in use, not shared across all of them. So that might be kind of included in those discussions and questions and scenarios for the topologies. And yeah, Frankie pasted the link for topologies. I also have it in my architecture options link. I'm going to add a couple of other, from my perspective, useful links here, and then we are going to share this PowerPoint on the Discord channel for the community. And that's, I think, it's that I have prepared for today. It's 7 minutes past the hour, but any questions, maybe something that we can quickly address?
I love this very first session because a lot of these are agnostic, right? You know, these are, this just covers architecture in general and not specifically VMware stuff. So I think this is great. Yeah, so please ask your questions, get clarification. This is definitely the time. And if you don't right now, you can definitely jump into the Discord as well.
You can find me there as well, yes.
What are we going to talk about next session? We're going to be covering section 3.
We will definitely cover section 3. Let me just quickly check. Oops. I had it somewhere. I just need to close some of those windows. And for the next one, that was definitely section 3. And I think something else. Yes, or no. So section 3 is a big one. So for the next one, I planned to cover objective 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, and 3.4, because they are talking about logical and physical designs, and they are divided into the logical and physical for the network infrastructure, the management domain, workload domain, edge, automation and operations. So there are, it's not a big number of objectives, but lots of stuff in it. So that will be the plan for the next session.
Excellent. All right, so section 3 objectives 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, and 3.4. And yeah, how Pawel said, 3.3 and 3.4 have a whole bunch of subtasks or sub objectives. There are grip in there. So yeah, this will be great.
So maybe a small disclaimer. Yeah? That's the plan, but we will see how it will be, because if it will take too much time, then we are going to, let's say, split it into maybe 2 chunks, but we will see.
Okay, so we're sitting at Connect. Oh yes, VMware Connect, VMUG, VMware User Group Connect, happening in 2 weeks. Yes, in 2 weeks. If you're attending, I believe if you're an Advantage member, you get to sit the exam for free. You get to choose if you want to attempt the administrator exam or the architect exam. And please, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong on that one. But yes, everybody gets a free attempt, right? The Advantage members.
Yes, that's correct.
Excellent. And if you're a vExpert, if you're a VMTN moderator, right, in VMware communities, yeah, you automatically get one of those free licenses or the free subscriptions to VMUG Advantage. So you're in there. Yeah, so please, yeah, definitely make the time and take it, right? Yeah, go ahead and take it. I took this exam, this architect one, and I failed. And interestingly enough, the stuff that just got covered today, that's where I failed. I passed all the other stuff, right? You know, pass or fail. You get like you get
List
notes
of
afterwards.
objectives, I think, yeah.
Yes, yeah. You get your notes and you say, okay, you know, this is where you may have missed 1 or 2 things, and yeah, the objectives that I failed were here. So, yeah, just goes to show you. All right. Well, thank you very much. I think we can wrap this up, right, Pal?
Yep, definitely. Thanks for attending.
Perfect.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Can you unshare your screen? Just
Oh,
for
of course.
perfect. Thank you.
Done.
Excellent. And then so yes, so we'll link up, and yes, we will have the link to possibly the document, the one that you just shared with. All these links, right? We'll have in Discord. Just like we did with the administrator exam. I'll create a blog post with a summary of the questions, and I'll try to capture the questions and some of the answers, hopefully, that we had in the discussion here. I'll create a blog post just to keep everybody on track. All right. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you Friday next week. Yeah, next week, same time.
Next week.
Excellent.
Guys.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Pal. Thank you, everyone. Later.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, bye.